Okay, in practical classes that you do, you will often be given data that is pretty well been cleaned and ready for you. There might be a few little things in there that we're hoping to test you on that you might be able to locate, but for the most part the data is nowhere near as messy as it is when you get it in real life. And so in this presentation I'm just going to give you some hacks for cleaning and validating data, and the reason is nothing causes us more of a headache and no activity has caused me more grief than trying to clean and validate data. So the most important thing we're going to do before you even start any form of data validation or exploration is you're going to make sure that you have a backup, uncleaned, unmanipulated version of the data. Now, other people will also tell you that you should do all of your data cleaning using code. So for example, if you need to delete a row or change one value from 23 to 25, that you will use code to do it. And in a perfect world, that would be the way you would handle it. However, in order to write the code that enables all the data cleaning to happen, you need to actually have a high degree of competency in coding, and so that skill takes time, and a lot of people don't actually have it. And to be honest, for simple processes of data cleaning, I will actually just work through it in Excel. But, and here's a really important but, is I keep very detailed notes about what I did. So I will either in a notebook, in an actual physical notebook, or in a electronic notebook, so something like Evernote or OneNote, I will write down, for example, record number 48 was deleted, record number whatever, I did something too. Okay, so the reason is that whether you do it in code or whether you do it that way, you need to be able to backtrack and work out what you did. Okay, all right, so how do we go about error checking? First thing you might want to do is to sort your data in ascending and descending order and look for extreme values, which could mean that there is a data entry error. You want to check for consistency, so if you have dates and one should come after the other, so mating should come before calving, then check that that actually is the case in your data set, and don't be surprised when it's not. The other thing that you may want to do is graph variables to check they make sense in the context of each other. So for example, you may get a very plausible milk yield from a farm, but when you actually plot the milk yield against the herd size, it may suddenly become implausible. All right. Now, the sorting, ascending and descending order is really only going to pick up extremes. It is equally plausible that you have values that make sense, but they were entered wrong. So what will happen in studies with a reasonable budget is you will actually often end up with a double entry, and they will then check that both people entered the same value. Other examples where I've seen this is someone will hand enter and then the data entry forms will be scanned and comparisons will be made. If you don't have that technology available to you, then the other option I think is always worth doing is check 5 to 10% of your data, so that you can kind of get a feeling for how bad are the data entry errors. And there are times, and it has happened to us, where we did that and we found a huge number of errors. And so when we went back and had a closer look, we realized that that entire section which was entered by a temp person was entered wrong, and we needed to go back and re-enter the data. Okay, so we're going to check for errors. We're going to do a quick ascend, descend, see what the extreme values are. We're going to check particularly if there are things like dates, that they follow a consistent pattern. You're going to graph variables against each other to see they make sense in context. And if it is at all possible, you will check 5 to 10% of the data against the originals to sort of get a feeling for how bad the problem is. So what happens if you find an error? Well, if it was entered incorrectly, then correct it and make a note that it was done, and I'm going to give you a tip on how to do that in a moment. If it was entered correctly, we have a decision to make. Okay, so if the data was actually what was on the form, but it looks wrong, then we need to decide if it's plausible. If it's plausible, the data must remain and should not be excluded at any point. Okay. If it's implausible, then the observation may be excluded, either entirely from the data set, so you might remove all of that whole variable and not deal with it, or you may just exclude it when you're doing the analysis for which that variable is missing. The key thing though is you never actually delete the observation from the data set. So the way I handle any form of exclusion in my Excel spreadsheets is to create two new variables, one called something like exclude and one called exclude comment. And this is what they look like. Okay, and what I do is I go through and I say, well, if I want to exclude it, then I put a 1, and if I want to keep it in, I put a 0, and I write the reason. Now, why do I go to that much trouble? Well, firstly, it's happened enough times to me that I've decided that my criteria, oh, maybe I shouldn't have excluded that, and I want to go back and change my mind. And so just being able to go back through and change that 1 to a 0, and it makes it really simple, and I rerun the code. So sometimes my first line of code, if there's an exclude column, is to filter so that exclude equals 0. The other reason is that examiners and paper reviewers are always going to want to know details of how many I excluded and how many for each reason. Okay, so I need to keep both pieces of information. And if they're there and they're there in the hard data set, it's really, really simple for me to be able to pull that out. So the key takeaway is for this is if you are going to exclude variables, don't actually delete the row. Simply write exclude and exclude reason, and then a 0, 1. So 1 is it's going to be excluded, 0 it retains, and the reason why. And that will mean that you can go back and change your mind, and you can actually also count the reasons. Okay. I hope you've enjoyed those presentations, and any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.